So while some claim that the kingdom of silence is over, well, this famous kingdom of silence under the Assad regime, others say that they prefer to use pen names, for example. And I've heard this might be the case of foreign journalists as well. So this has been due to sensitive reporting.
Welcome to Near East, the podcast that tries to make sense of what's happening in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. Today our guest is Natacha Danon, a researcher and journalist based in Damascus and executive director of Syria Direct, an independent publication born during the Assad regime to report on Syria. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise.
I would like to start from the beginning. How did you start reporting and researching on Syria?
Sure. So I actually started working on Syria in 2017. I started as a researcher working at various NGOs doing conflict analysis cross-border from Jordan. So looking at opposition-controlled areas as well as Kurdish-controlled areas in the northeast. I was unable to travel to Syria due to the sensitive nature of my work, but continued to work on Syria up until today.
Why Syria?
Why Syria? So this is more a personal question, but my interest in the region started during the Iraq War and issues around Palestine. So the U.S. has for decades had deep implications in the region. So part of my interest was trying to understand what the U.S. was doing in the region, what impacts it was having. And that's kind of how my world got opened to the region.
Looking back, how would you compare the situation of freedom of speech related to journalism, to research during the Assad regime and the current government?
Sure. So the current media environment for journalists is incomparable to what it was under the Assad regime. So the Assad regime murdered hundreds of journalists, including some foreign journalists like Marie Colvin. However, while these security risks are not nearly at the same level, there is a persistent fear. So journalists as well as sources, essentially, you can't emerge from a culture of fear that's been built over decades overnight. So there is consistent concerns from journalists. There's some hesitation in terms of understanding what the red lines are of the new administration, the new government. So while some claim that the kingdom of silence is over, well, this famous kingdom of silence under the Assad regime, others say that they prefer to use pen names, for example. And I've heard this might be the case of foreign journalists as well. So this has been due to sensitive reporting.
Based on your experience, you reported a lot on sensitive issues under the Assad regime, the Northeast as well, Kurdish forces. How is your work different now as a foreign journalist?
Sure. So I started working on Syria in 2022 as a journalist. Prior to that, I'd been working exclusively in research. At the time, it was only possible to do interviews via WhatsApp. So we had a network of journalists on the ground, but when I was doing reporting by myself, it was exclusive via WhatsApp. So we took numerous precautions. We would use WhatsApp, encrypted platforms like WhatsApp Signal. We would also use pseudonyms for sources, as well as at times pen names for the journalists on the actually more often than not, especially in regime-controlled areas. So that has since changed dramatically. A lot of people, when the Assad regime fell, actually announced what their pen names had been and came out with their real identity. Since then, some have expressed remorse that they did that, especially people working on sensitive topics related to the coast, Sueda, and other areas that have been sites of conflict. So yeah, I would say the access is completely different than it used to be as well. So before, Syria was fragmented into various zones of control. So you had regime-controlled areas, opposition-controlled areas, and Kurdish-controlled areas. Today, these artificial borders, as one could portray them as, have since dissipated. There's still portions of the south, the Druze-controlled majority province of Sueda. However, in general, it's very easy to go from one place to the next, with some, at times, access constraints that are imposed by the Ministry of Information.
Can you explain a little bit more the role that Syria Direct played during the Assad regime?
So Syria Direct was founded in 2013 in Amman, Jordan. It recruited journalists, both foreign journalists and Syrian journalists, that created hybrid work modalities that encouraged Syrian journalists working with foreign journalists in a way that essentially the expertise, the contextual understanding, and the wide-ranging sources that Syrian journalists had were used in complement to the skills that foreign journalists would have, having the knowledge to speak to a foreign audience. So that was a unique model that subsequently evolved. Initially, Syria Direct was exclusively an English language publication, providing access to information for foreign audiences that had no access to Syria, given the serious access constraints for both journalists as well as NGO workers, such as those that were working in opposition-controlled areas. It was impossible for them to go to Syria.
You mentioned that Syria Direct would promote the collaboration between Syrian journalists and foreign reporters, including Westerns. Why do you think it's important for local journalists to work with international reporters, and the same for international reporters to work with local journalists?
So the benefit of having Syrians and non-Syrians working together is that something that a Syrian journalist thinks is a given is something that a foreign journalist will understand needs more of an explanation. A foreign journalist is able to essentially see things that a Syrian journalist won't necessarily see. And the opposite is true as well, because of course Syrians are ultimately the ones that have the connections, the sources, the contextual knowledge. So it's definitely something that's complementary. Unfortunately, we often don't see credits going to Syrian journalists. They're typically labeled as fixers and don't get their name recognition in pieces. Typically, they have invisible work that goes behind any given piece. However, there's definitely room for a lot of synergies between Syrian and foreign journalists.
And how is the situation now when it comes to local reporting and research in Syria?
So it depends on if we're referring to foreign or Syrian journalists, although I often say that the two are complementary. So any increase in freedoms or decrease in freedoms, press freedoms for Syrian journalists will affect foreign journalists and vice versa. Today, I can speak to the situation as a foreign journalist first and foremost. So unfortunately, we're still at a point where there's no long-term press accreditation. So we're required to enter and exit the country every month. And there have been restrictions on access in the past. So when there's been highly sensitive political moments of state violence, such as what we saw in Sueda, the coast, and even more recently in northeast Syria, the Ministry of Information has restricted access. So that's definitely something that's concerning. But overall, though, the access is certainly an improvement compared to what it was under the Assad regime, but that should by no means be the benchmark. Syria should always be striving for standards well above those that were set by the Assad regime.
And what about local reporters based on your acquaintances, on the journalists that you know on the ground?
Sure. So essentially, Syrian journalists don't benefit from the same diplomatic coverage that, say, a Western journalist would have. Ultimately, they're here to stay. Most cannot leave the country easily. So if there's any sort of pressures, then they bear the brunt of those pressures. But ultimately, I would argue that it's important more than ever to focus on Syrian journalists because for this reason, they're here to stay. Whereas foreign journalists, access could be restricted in the future. And ultimately, it will be, absolutely worst case scenario, we could see a situation emerging like in the past. Undoubtedly not at the same level, but in a situation where access is more restricted for foreign journalists, and therefore there will be a need for strong Syrian journalists on the ground who can do that reporting.
How has access to sources, information, and also trust towards the media changed in the last year since the fall of the regime?
So before, it was very difficult, especially in areas controlled by the Assad regime, to get people who would talk. And there's tremendous amount of fear. Since then, since the fall of the Assad regime, people have been very open. Part of it is born by a sense of hope. I think that they think that journalism can actually has a role in enacting change. I think the more people get disillusioned, the less likely people are going to be interested in talking to the press, which hopefully will not be the case, but that could be something that could happen. After we've seen peak levels of violence, for example, in Sueda or the coast or northeast Syria to a much lesser extent, but there were armed clashes. But when we saw sectarian violence on the coastal areas and in Sueda, sources have become very fearful of speaking. So sometimes they'll decline to speak to me as a journalist. Other times they'll require or ask that I use a pseudonym. So that's an unfortunate evolution that we've seen. But overall, of course, the people are much more open to speaking to the press than before.
I'm wondering, during the Assad regime, you conducted these interviews remotely on Signal, on WhatsApp. How would you find people that were open to talk to you?
So this is a difficult question. Essentially, it was for Syrian journalists in particular, they had built networks over time. So we have journalists who have been with Syria Direct for over 10 years. And so over the span of all these years, they've built extensive networks of sources. I myself had sources that I was familiar with from when I'd worked as a researcher. I was able, sometimes you just cold call people. In terms of CSOs, communities-based organizations and NGOs, it's possible to get in contact, but for sure in regime-controlled areas, it was always a challenge, as I mentioned, due to widespread fear. But with time, usually you can connect with an organization that will connect you with people on the ground if you don't already have those existing contacts. So there's always a way to get contacts, but of course, Syrian journalists are going to have a much wider network usually than any foreign journalist will possibly have.
What challenges and opportunities do you see for the future of Syria when it comes to freedom of speech and the freedom of the press?
So I would say that today represents a tremendous opportunity for journalists, but also civil society more largely, to essentially create a space for freedom of expression, for freedom of dissent, to be able to serve as essentially a way of upholding accountability. So being able to openly critique the government and its programs, its shortcomings, is critical for the transition of the country as it moves from decades of authoritarianism, conflict, and war to a country that is prosperous and stable. So I would say it's definitely a tremendous opportunity, and people need to be pushing against these red lines so that myself and others don't get confined to a shrinking space for freedom of expression and freedom of media more largely. However, there are a few challenges to that. As I mentioned, there's a culture of fear that's been installed for decades that's very difficult to break. So people are sometimes self-censoring, and that goes for Syrian journalists as well as foreign journalists. The other thing is that the country is increasingly polarized. So although there's a high level degree of polarization at the time of the Assad regime, that polarization has no less decreased. So in a way, I would argue. So essentially you have divisions along political, ethnic, social, religious lines that have drawn in journalists themselves. So journalists, as we know, this is also the case for foreign journalists, but we're not completely independent and neutral. So knowing how to set those beliefs aside and conduct independent reporting is key. So it's really important to be investing in journalism, specifically Syrian journalism at this point in time, because as I said, Syrian journalists are here to stay. And so it's a key and pivotal time to be investing in their capacity and supporting them.
Thank you so much, Natacha.
You're welcome.